Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Your Freedom Hub's Free Market Cash Patient. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with Charles Froman. We're sponsored by the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, Freedom, which is the acronym MPHWF.com, and it is absolutely the disruptor's intersection. And you're going to see that pretty readily here yet again tonight. We do record all of these for posterity. But before we even get into that, we just wanted to point out we're here for a reason, and there are some problems in the healthcare world, and we just like to use this image. It tells the tale so well, and it comes down to kind of us reconnecting with our provider and getting away from everybody interfering in between what we're trying to accomplish. To help make that happen, we work with this award-winning app, and it allows you to connect doctors with patients directly. They're advertising, as it were, their services with pricing. You like it, you connect with them, you pay them, and there is no third party in this instance. So this is kind of like the Amazon for making the doctor and patient world work. As I said, we are up on the site, so let's take a quick detour over there. You can either use that an acronym or the mphealthwealthfreedom.com link altogether. There's a lot of great tabs to explore, some really interesting stuff in all of these drop downs, but let's take a look at a couple of them real quick. As I said initially, we do have that revolution in what's going on in healthcare, and so here's a little more details about that particular app under the health tab. First one, the revolution in healthcare. But then if we go over to the webinar page, so if you're on home and you hover, there's webinars and continuing the conversation. So the webinar one we'll come back to, but more importantly then becomes a continuing the conversation, because after the talk, you usually get motivated or activated to want to participate and help further the cause or learn more. And here's your way to connect with the people that we've had on here in the past that are a way for you to keep things going and further the cause. On the webinar site itself, we feature the different episodes, and we'll talk about this in a minute. We'll come back to, but we do also show the future guests, and then also the links to the past episodes are always posted over the weekend. So come Monday morning, you can come back to any of these, although I would encourage you to sign up at every one of them as a subscriber, because it helps us trend. And each of these has a different audience, and these messages are worth getting out to as many people as possible. As a taste of it, here's the Brighteon site, and you'll see they go back a long time and why we want to continue the conversation, because you might want to click on something that's like all about 5G here already from 5 months ago. Seems like it's a year ago already, but you might find out about that. It's an important topic, and here's your chance to then continue that conversation. The other big issue before we get into the webinar part of it is the fighting for our freedom. So under the freedom tab, the first drop down, this is another critical area on a regular basis, because we always change out and post the most important issues, and you really need to click on every one of these, sadly, to participate or sign your name or just make your voice heard. And then we also have a continuing and growing collection of other organizations that are helping work on all these facets for you. And you really do need to be aware of all of these, as it were, because each one usually has a different topic or function, and they're all pretty important. So we just wanted you to be aware of them. So on that note, though, let's dig into tonight, because this is going to be pretty interesting. So let's see what Terry has in store for us. And I'm going to have Charles give us a nice introduction here.
Well, hopefully it'll be nice, Jeff, but thank you. And well, welcome, Terry. This is a topic that always is part of healthcare, expense prescriptions specifically, not the medical marijuana type conversation that we have sometimes. And, you know, Trump did work hard to bring some affordability to drugs, but that hasn't stopped retirees or people with chronic conditions from complaining about drugs. And we have an expert tonight, Terry Wilcox from Patients Rising, who has a background with survivors and caregivers and medical professionals. And she's very skilled at creating stories to get the point across. She worked with Selma Schwimmel an early survivor at Vital Options International, and we'll let her describe that more. And tonight's topic really is a Biden plan, or what his plan should be. All the drug issues that we should know about and really push. I noticed a couple in there that I like the bottleneck at the FDA. That the Food and Drug Administration certainly needs some pretty powerful reform, and patient empowerment, which of course is near and dear to Jeff and my heart, since Forbes featured, our cash patient making plan for empowering patients. Terry has written in Fortune and Real Clear Health, and I'm looking forward, Jeff, to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Terry, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and give control back to you.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Oh,
I'm going to share my screen here. Hang on. I'm going to do that and share and play from start.
excellent.
Okay. So, welcome everyone who's on here tonight. I run two advocacy organizations, Patients Rising and Patients Rising Now. Patients Rising is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's dedicated to providing education, support, and resources and advocacy for people living with chronic and life-threatening illnesses. Our vision is an inclusive healthcare system where all patients have transparent, affordable access to the treatments they need. Now, because of what we deal with a lot, which is cost of medicines and access to prescriptions, though that's not all we deal with. I mean, we deal with everything from, access to rides, access to transportation, access to caregivers when you're undergoing treatment. And we deal a lot with patients who are chronically ill or, going through a life-threatening illness situation, maybe cancer, which can sometimes be a temporary hijacking of your life. And then oftentimes you can get that back in some, once the treatment's over. And then there's many chronic disease patients that I like to say are living vitally great lives because of innovation and things like biologics. But they're constantly struggling with the access to those particular drugs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. I'm going to try to take you through our first thing. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the policy actions. We wrote a policy paper about things that it was our wish list, whether it was Trump or Biden who won. And now it's our wish list for Biden. And I'm going to kind of go through that towards the end. But before I do that, I kind of want to talk everyone through the drug supply chain. And the reason I want to do that is because oftentimes, I think it was kind of touched on in the opening, it is true that President Trump lowered the cost of drugs, and you'll see that in some of the slides I'm going to show, for an enormous number of people. And even the overall rising of list prices and costs of drugs themselves. However, because of benefit design and what patients are forced to pay out of pocket through coinsurance, high deductibles, et cetera. I mean, you guys know the drill. They're not able to afford their medicines. And especially if they're these medicines that are, like I said, biologics, they're not generics. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is what we call the cookie jar of drug pricing, the biopharmaceutical companies. We've got the wholesalers, hospitals, providers, doctors, PBMs, insurers, public payers, brokers, academics, people doing clinical trials. This is, I'm just going to kind of give a broad overview. And before I go into these slides, because I'm going to try to move through them quickly, if you're at all interested in anything I have to say, or at all interested in the drug supply chain as a whole, I highly recommend you follow Adam Fine at drugchannels.net. He does this for a living. He lives and breathes and sleeps it. And a lot of the charts and things that I'm going to talk about here came from him anyway. So he's a fantastic resource if you have any interest in really understanding the drug supply chain, which is a complicated mess. Almost 50% of brand name spending is retained by the supply chain. And as you can see, that has, back in 2013, it was almost 67%. And now we're down to, pharmaceutical manufacturer retains a little bit over 50%. And I would argue that now in 2020, it's probably right at 50, if not a little bit below in some instances. It depends on the drug. the list to net price differential. This is huge. This is a huge topic, which is, the list price growth. List prices used to be raised, and this is where I'll show you what President Trump did. List prices were getting raised 13% a year, back as early ago as 2014. And in 2019, it was only 4.9%. 2018, and it's even less now. I mean, they take these tiny little incremental, but the average is only 4.9%, where it used to be 13.5. And now the average of net price growth, which Adam Fine will call this the gross to net bubble, is they actually often lose money, even when they raise the price, because of the rebates. And here, Drug Channels Institute, that's giving credit. So list prices go up, net prices go down. Who benefits? Where does the money go? Well, this is Humalog. This is insulin, which we all know is crazy, which I can't even believe in 2014 that the average list price of insulin, any insulin in America, was $391. That's insane. We all know it's insane. And the average, but this was the average price after rebate. But this has actually declined and gone on a sort of, even and in many companies. I know if you look at the big three are Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk. They're underwater actually on a lot of that. They raised it just to pay the rebates. That's really the only reason they raise it. Did I? Yeah, there we go. Sorry. And this is another one, Humira, where you can kind of look at where the money goes. In 2014, the list price was $2,914, $2,600 went to the middleman, etc. It's $5,000. Now there's other things, and I'll just kind of chime this in right here. There's other things that cause this as well, besides just rebates, and especially with a lot of these drugs, which is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 340B program, but that's a program where we're able to basically give drug. Humira on the 340B program, depending on the hospital or the situation, can be bought by a hospital for a qualifying hospital or community center for as low as $1. So that often adds to this list price conundrum as well. And then you've got the pharmacy benefit managers who've had literally a 611% increase in what they're taking since here. So you see $291 rebate in 2014, $2,070 rebate in 2019, Humira. And that's a major part of the driver. Do rebates impact list prices? They absolutely do, because if you have certain drugs on a formulary, say some of these biologics that, I often use immunology arthritis drugs because there's many of them. There's a lot of biosimilars, et cetera. So in that particular space, there's a lot of, jockeying for position. Same thing with insulin. There's 3 companies, et cetera. So the list price is huge, and it's constantly being raised. So even in many instances, and I may talk about this in another slide, biosimilars, which technically should be cheaper. And for those of you who don't know what a biosimilar is, it's a generic biologic, though any pharma company would yell at me right now and be like, it's not, it's a biologic. It is a biologic, but it's the very similar, highly similar to the original drug product, because you cannot make a generic of a biologic. But technically the biosimilar should be cheaper. In many instances, because an older drug can give a bigger rebate, they'll have a higher list price, but be giving a bigger rebate, where the biologic isn't in that place, the biosimilar is not in that place yet. So it's a mess. How much do patients save if the PBMs share the savings? Now, you heard Donald Trump talk about this a little bit. Now, the PBM sued against this particular rule. No, they haven't sued against it. I think they have, but I don't think they won in this case. But Biden has actually put a halt on all of, Trump's rules and executive orders that hadn't been enacted yet for 60 days to review them. And there is one with sharing the savings, where PBM, you share the savings, because a lot of times if a patient is paying for their drug based on the list price of a drug, whether they have insurance or don't have insurance, if they're paying based on a list prices matter. And you'll often hear a lot of people in hospitals and pharma and everywhere else where list prices don't really matter, but they do matter. They do matter. They matter very much for patients, especially if you're uninsured. So in this case, if you have, so let's say insulin, let me just take insulin. Let's say there's a $500 list price vial of insulin. It's got an 85% rebate, and that is no joke. Okay, it's not a 50% rebate there. It's like 75, 85. I've even heard 90% sometimes. Okay, so let's just for, as an average, let's say it's 75. Let's say it's 75%. We have a 500, we have a $500 list price drug. 125 of it is actually the cost. If a patient's responsible for 20% of $125, they would be responsible for $25. Whereas if they're responsible for 20, or if they're responsible for 25% or 20% or whatever, they would be responsible for this very small amount of money. Whereas if they were doing 20% of $500, they're responsible for $100. So the savings is significant, and it does matter. Generic prices, on the other hand, have plummeted. And this has happened this very much has happened overall. I mean, it happened before Trump, and it's just been continuing. But here the generic prices are just literally, total CPI is going down. Do patients and states overpay for medicines? Absolutely. Many of you may have heard of the Ohio Medicaid case. There's something called clawbacks where you can overpay for prescription drugs, and the copay clawback where almost a quarter of filled pharmacy prescriptions, 23%, involved patient copayment that exceeded the average reimbursement paid by the insurer. So I don't know how many of you have heard of that. Does rebate contracting create the misaligned incentives? Well, absolutely, it creates misaligned incentives. And this is a little bit more complicated slide, so I'm not really going to go through that one as much. But here's what we want at Patients Rising. We want high-value care at a price we can afford without the use of discriminatory measurements like quality-adjusted life years, which basically count a person who's sick as less than one. I'm not going to talk as much about that tonight, but that's one of the things on our agenda that we're really educating on, because there's a move to have something like NICE in the UK, that basically a national formulary, which we don't want. We want a free market. You want you want the most effective medicine at a cost you can afford, and not somebody telling you that you're not worth the cost of this medicine, or you're too old for this medicine. I mean, there's even, if you look at some of the op-eds and things that Zeke Emanuel has written, one of the ones he wrote several years ago was that if you were over 75 and you got terminally ill, you should just, not be treated. I don't think he probably still has that same opinion, considering the president of the United States right now is 78 years old. But it's interesting, that is a movement. And one of the things that was really on our radar with this administration and with the Democrats in general, because there is a larger push for Medicare for all, which we don't think is good. We want healthcare back in the hands of doctors and their patients, obviously, efficient and affordable access to treatments for all patients. And from where I sit, we need a robust innovation pipeline funded by public-private partnerships and venture capital. This is something that we're hopeful for in the Biden administration, because he is a pro-innovation person because of circumstances in his own family with his son, and he had the Biden Cancer Initiative and other things. But there's a lot of things like the QALYs and other things like that that sort of offset that. And so we sort of are watching both ends of that. We also think that these secret contracts, these PBM secret contracts we should end those. What we don't want is low value care sucking the dollars away from high value care. I'm sure many of you understand that. Again, the rise of discriminatory value frameworks using QALYs, allowing PBMs and insurers to practice medicine, which happens every day in this country. I'm sure many of you know that. Continual creation of denials with hoops. Oh, I got back.
with hoops for doctors and their patients to jump through with things like copay accumulators, step therapy protocols, you know, prior authorizations that are excessive. You know, once a year maybe is fine, but once every 2 or 3 months is not fine. That's a lot. When you know a person who's got type 1 diabetes is still going to need insulin, or MS, or whatever the chronic disease may be. We don't want fewer innovations. There are more than 7,000 rare disease conditions with no treatment, so we want to support that pipeline. And we don't want a discriminatory system like those in Canada and the UK that use QALYs to determine access. These are pro-patient solutions. One of the things that's on our agenda, which kind of happened because they sued and got an injunction and it didn't start, but we were not a fan. This is one of the things we were not a fan of former President Trump's, was his most favored nations rule. And part of that was we agreed in the fact that we should be paying the lowest price, but we didn't agree with the way, the comparisons, to putting the U.S. in the position to suddenly be having to work with, have our price be based on countries that are socialized medicine, which have oftentimes these countries don't have access to the medicines as quickly as we do. There were many reasons why that was not a good rule. And there were other ways we thought that he could have been more efficient with it in having other people, as he often said, pay their fair share of drug development, which could have been done possibly in trade negotiations. There were many people with bigger brains than mine that had thought about these things that we thought were interesting, and other ways, because that's one of the biggest beefs, is the United States is paying for innovation for the rest of the world. It is true. And how can we get the rest of the world to ante up? We were not a fan of that rule. We were glad to see it halted. We'll see, but there's many things in it that are the Democrats really do love, so it could come back to haunt us. Ending copay accumulators. I don't know if any of you know what copay accumulators are, but basically a lot of these more expensive biologic medications, when the ACA was passed and co-insurance and premiums and everything started to rise, especially for those folks who are working Americans paying for their health care. It was almost unaffordable, $8,100 deductible. So pharma stepped in and said, okay, well, we don't want our patients off our drugs. We're paying all these rebates. The list prices are expensive. So we're going to help our patients out with copay assistance. This is actually assistance. There's other things like GoodRx and copay can all get very confusing. But this would be like, say, an MS patient, an arthritis patient who has a chronic disease, who has a drug that has a list price of, $4,000 or $5,000 a month. They can't really afford that. And their $700 a month premium and their $8,100 deductible all at the same time. So all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, insurers started implementing something called a copay accumulator. What happens with that is the insurance company and the PBM take your copay assistance, but when it runs out, because say pharma may give you a $25,000 copay assistance grant for the year, whatever it is, it'll run out, and all of a sudden the patient will show up at the pharmacy counter or their specialty pharmacy or wherever they get their medicine, and the pharmacist will say, that'll be $4,326, please. And that's because the PBM took all the assistance, but they didn't count $1 of it toward their deductible or to help them in any way. And there's many patients and many folks that argue, well, that's not what happens when, if you get hit by a bus, you got to pay your whole deductible. Well, that's true. That's true. I can understand that argument. But these are patients who are basically totally healthy, except for this one innovation that's keeping them alive. And this is the situation they find themselves in. They're caught in this supply chain mess. And it's not something that's an easy cash price fix. There just isn't, not for these types of medicines. And then there's step therapy, where you can yank stable patients on and off their drugs, or make them jump through hoops year after year, sometimes the same hoops. And like I said earlier, excessive prior authorizations. We want to identify real affordable healthcare options instead of rehashing the same flawed talking points. My favorite flawed talking point that I hate the most is pre-existing conditions. Both parties talk about it all the time now. It's just the stupidest thing. And reason being is that, you know, yeah, you can say, we don't discriminate giving insurance to people with pre-existing conditions, but when you put copay accumulators, step therapy, and excessive prior authorizations and all sorts of hoops they have to jump through to get the medicine that they need to live a full, vibrant life, then you're just discriminating against the pre-existing condition in another way. And that's what they've done. And so it's just a useless talking point. Stop allowing insurers and PBMs to hide behind ERISA. Employers, this is like the Employers Regulatory Act, where they, there was a case just won in Arkansas. The state of Arkansas sued the PBMs in their state because they wanted to regulate them. Because oftentimes PBMs will say, "Oh, we're protected by ERISA, which is a federal law." And even when you're talking about it as an advocate, it's like, "Oh, we have to go into ERISA to change that." It's like nobody ever wants to do that. Well, the Supreme Court voted 9-0 in December in favor of the state of Arkansas to be able to regulate PBMs, and that was a big win, we thought, for us, and a big opening for possible more advocacy in that space in the future. Creating pathways for the FDA and states to work together on access to these high-cost treatments. A lot of times they get developed and there's so much regulatory red tape at the FDA, and then there's regulatory tape at the states, where the states can take up to a year for an innovation that people have been waiting for to figure out how they're going to determine who can get it, or what the delivery process is going to be. There's a lot of, just poor design of delivery that we would like to see fleshed out. We're a really innovative world right now. I mean, look, we've all managed to sort of adjust to just like living on Zoom and all these other things. I think that we can figure out how to deliver healthcare in a streamlined fashion. Again, this is my other rant about keeping ICER and qualities out of the government. ICER is something called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They want to be the NICE of the United States. They're a group based in Boston. You can find out all about them on our website. And then we are very pro the 21st Century Cures 2.0 of some kind, with a real push towards modernizing healthcare delivery, and finally ensuring shared costs for shared innovation. Why am I going backwards? Sorry, I have one of those mice. Here we go. Okay. And we're going to talk quickly through these drug price solutions. Immediate fix, share the savings directly with the patients at the point of sale at the pharmacy counter. Long-term fix is get rid of contracting via rebates and go to net price contracting. Longer-term fix is mandating fees for services instead of % of the retail price, meaning pharma pays fees to the PBMs for whatever data they, can get, or whatever the things are they're getting. They're paying a fee for it. It's not a % of list price. Tying everything to the list price has really, really ruined the supply chain and put patients in the middle of this, what Scott Gottlieb artfully called this kabuki drug pricing supply chain. Ensure lower price alternatives are preferred, meaning biosimilars and generics and not the other way around, and being aware of monopolies in the supply chain, and also paying for high value treatments, paying for high value outcomes, for good outcomes. So that's my talk. I know that I was supposed to wrap up, and
that was good. No,
ask me more questions. That's me before COVID. Now I'm home with my kids. So this is what I look like.
That's funny. We're definitely going to have some people have questions for sure. So if you'll do me a favor, everyone, and raise your hand icon, and we'll go into that.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, I'll take it off there. Hold on a second. I'll snag it back real quick. Yeah, go ahead. Can click on the stop share if you're able for a second there.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Okay, good.
Okay.
Charles, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Jeff and Terry. Very thorough itemization of all the problems with the drug supply chain. And I think it really will help voters and policy advocates understand a bit better. It's not as simple as just controlling prices or implementing, nationwide death panels, or, whatever you want to call that, nicer ICER that social systems use. There's a lot of questions I have just to kind of get into more detail because I don't know much about some of these things.
Sure.
Let's start with that last thing you mentioned with that longer term pricing percentages and fees. Is that something you can kind of repeat in a way that might make it understandable?
Sure. So right now, there's a lot of, in the price of a drug, oftentimes everything is sort of packed into the list price. It's a percentage of that. Whereas there's actually, and I've had a mentor that's really, strong in the drug supply chain. And basically there's things within that really high priced rebate that could be siphoned off as fees, and everything should just be a fee, sort of like the wholesaler. The wholesaler gets such and such amount per prescription. They get whatever it is. It's not a percentage. It's not tied to the price. When you tie things to the price, you tie things around a patient's neck. Because you're raising it for the patients in an extraordinary way that it shouldn't be that high for them. So there's just all sorts of things that I don't even necessarily understand, but I can only explain it in that they should just have a line item that's like, okay, we're getting the data for this. We're getting the amount of prescriptions filled, or we're getting the follow through on the patient, because there's a lot of data, unbranded or unmarked data that can be shared with, how patients are doing on the drugs, if they're, picking up their prescriptions, that kind of data, right? How many are picking them up, how many are abandoning them at the pharmacy counter, et cetera. I see a hand, he's going to help me. Anyway, so that is part of that. That's what I mean by the supply chain being able to, not tie everything to the price. The price should just be the price. Because if the price were just the price, it'd be a lot lower. As you see, be 50 to 60, sometimes 70 in the case of insulin, 80 or 90% lower. Robert Campbell.
Yes, Robert Campbell. I was just going to say.
He's really going to be able to help me here. He's like,
oh gosh,
Bob, he rescues us a lot.
No, he's way better at this than me. So I'm just here.
You're right on target. There's a few take-home messages. You're right about insulin. There's 3 manufacturers allowed to make insulin. They get about $100. By the time the PBMs collect all their fees, it's $800. So there's a real problem with these percentage of retail price. We'll call them rebates. Now, rebates are legalized kickbacks. So it creates a perverse incentive to raise that list price. And that's what we're caught in. That's the death spiral. So President Trump released a PBM rule. And like Terry said, there were 4 parts of his pricing strategy. 3 of them were from Pelosi, and they were lousy. The one thing which wasn't was the PBM rule, which says the PBM can just collect an administrative fee from now on. It's never a percentage of list price. There won't be an incentive to have crazy kabuka prices. But Terry is fantastic at this and everything when it comes to patients rising. I mean, she's a fantastic advocate. I just wanted to mention one thing, Terry, and it's to you and to the whole crew. I'm in the process. I have a commitment for a significant amount of money to raise awareness about PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers. It turns out they are really, 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 really bad. And we're going to have a communications campaign to take that to the public. Inside Washington, they now know that PBMs are bad, but we got to take it to the people so that the people can demand change. So get rid of PBMs. When we first studied the PBM fees, they were 37% of what you pay at the pharmacy, you and your insurance company combined. At this point, it's 47%. And that just goes in hidden contracts, like I call them, the rebates there, legalized kickbacks. That's all bad. So President Trump, when he introduced this, he went off the teleprompter once and he said, there's middlemen. Nobody knows who they are. Do you know who they are? No, nobody knows who they are. They're really rich, but we're going to make it so they're not rich anymore. We're going to take away their kickbacks. That's the secret to drug pricing. I love pharmacy companies that make innovative products. They need to make a profit. The PBMs do nothing. Thank you, Jeff, and for bringing these kinds of programs to us so we can learn. And thank you, Terry.
Oh, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. I was like, oh, Robert Campbell is going to rescue me here out of whatever I.
Very good. I think I saw Kishore had a question. Did you, in fact? Charles?
Okay, great.
Oh, there you
So,
go. Good.
excellent presentation. Can't disagree with anything. Now, my question is really about how come PBMs have so much leverage? I mean, drug manufacturers don't want them. Why would the purchaser want them? So, what's the story like?
Well, drug manufacturers don't want to be in the business of delivering drugs to patients. That's not what they do. And so PBMs, were basically, I guess, initially set up to technically lower the cost of drugs or get the best deal, which has slowly grown in, or I don't know if it was always that way or it just, but from the charts and things I've seen, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse to where it's actually truly a perverse incentive. And now it's very much like the PBMs and the insurers are all the same. They've all bought each other. The Express Scripts and is with, I think, Cigna, and this one is with CVS, is with somebody else. I don't have them all in front of me. I don't know the exact who's connected with who, but they're all sort of linked at this point. And I think that there's a lot of times the PBMs will say in their arguments to the public, they will say, no, we give 90% of it back to the plan or back to the employer in some cases. But we've never seen the contracts to actually know if that's true. And some people, Bob may have a little bit more insight on that. He may be able to chime in there, but we don't know exactly if that's true because they're secret. All the contracts are secret. But they are just, part of it. And to as a full disclosure, Patients Rising does receive funding from pharmaceutical companies, but they created this as well. They were in on the rebate game too, because it allowed them place on the formulary. So this is not, but now I think now that the whole world is trying to throw them under the bus, that the cost of medicines is all their fault. I think there's many, I don't know that all, I don't talk with our funders specifically about this particular issue all that often, because it's not anything we're paid to talk about. But I think many of them would just as soon, have them go away and have some other sort of system in place that wasn't so perverse as this is, or at least something that's more transparent to the point of fees that are, clear and itemized, so that patients aren't suffering under the crushing, under the crushing rise of list prices and rebates.
Very good. Paul, I see your hand is up.
Oh, yeah, some of it's already been addressed, and great presentation, by the way. But yeah, I wanted to see if we could focus a bit on the solution to make things more value-based and less on the list price. And again, some of that's been touched on, but just kind of focusing on how to get to the goal, so to speak.
I think many, from a value-based perspective, and I think many in pharma are ready to do this. I think that you've seen a shift. Back in the early 2000s, there were a lot of Me Too drugs. And prior to that, there's one cholesterol drug, and there's sometimes there's a couple coming out. You'll see there will be, say, a lot of innovation in, whatever fill in blank, multiple sclerosis, multiple myeloma. And you may see a few things coming. Migraine's an example. A few came out at the same time. They weren't all the same. They each reacted, they each did something slightly different. But I think pharma is much more willing at this point to have the cost be based on the value it brings to the supply chain, to the system, to other costs and variables. I think where you get the pushback is there's a very antiquated system in place and everybody's pretty happy with the status quo. I mean, many people who talk about price transparency in hospitals, hospitals shout the same thing. Oh, the charge master doesn't mean anything. Those prices don't mean anything. Well, they do mean something to patients who are paying cash and who get stuck with that bill. They mean something. So paying for value, high quality, value-based care, I think should be the number one thing that we're talking about, as opposed to finding ways to continue to pay for the status quo or for things just as they are. Because
I was going to say, I agree with that. Also, you mentioned the authorizations, the excessive authorizations. And that's something that I see in my world as well. If someone has complex care and they're getting multiple drugs, for example, they're not going to get better tomorrow. They're going to be living with this for a while, and it just impedes the progress. So as a patient advocate, I see that being a problem.
Yeah, it is. And there's just all kinds of things. Like, I'll use an example. There's sometimes you can get state-based legislation or state-based things passed. Like here in the state of Virginia, where I live, we have you shouldn't have to pay more than $50 for your insulin at the pharmacy counter. Great bill. They shouldn't. Nobody should. And copay accumulator ban if there's no generic equivalent. Well, that's all well and good until you're my friend who lives in Richmond, who works for an auto part company, and they have a self-insured plan. None of that applies to him. So his employer and his employer's PBM can use a copay accumulator, and they can charge him $800 list price for insulin based on his deductible. All of this stuff is these are just barriers to access and walls being put up when we should be trying to, tear these walls down and reconfigure it. Innovation is moving so quickly. Cures are coming. Innovation's happening. Look how fast we got a vaccine. It's incredible. We have to keep up with that in how we're delivering value-based care and how we're operating the entire healthcare delivery system. And I think, it's going to be up to patient advocates and folks like yourself to be pushing for that, because the swamp and the bureaucracy is not in and of itself going to do that.
No, sadly.
Thank you.
Valerie, I see your hand is up. All right, there you have to.
Hey.
There you are.
Here I am. I'm actually a patient, and I'm working on the treadmill because my blood sugar is too high right now, so I stopped it for a minute. But just to give a little feedback, first I want to say this is fabulous, absolutely fabulous. I want to shout out to Dr. Marian Mass. She's the one that got me connected to Patients Rising. I'm almost 53. This year, I will celebrate my 40th anniversary of having diabetes. And so I've seen a lot of changes in prices. Where I get confused, and I'm trying to educate myself. I don't even know if I was supposed to be on this call or not, but I'm thinking, I want to educate myself. I want to be an advocate for others. Am I better off not even using insurance? I feel like I'm being punished because I have a full-time job. I get insurance through my employer, and yet I pay a boatload for everything. There are certain things I've learned to just say, I'll pay cash for that, or I'll get it out of the country because I can't get what I need because there are so many hoops to jump through. Any insight or
Well, there's
If I'm off base, I apologize.
no, there's many things, and I really feel, I really feel, especially living with type 1 diabetes, and my dad, who just passed away earlier this year, he was 73. He had kidney cancer and type 1 diabetes for 50 years and a variety of other ailments. He broke his leg and all kinds of things. And one of the biggest complaints from my dad was always that they would keep changing the types of strips he could get, or the machine it would work with, or, you know, the tester you could have, or
the
the
insulin.
Yeah, or the insulin you could
Yes.
have when you were, you know, you liked this insulin. My dad liked the Lilly insulin. You know, he didn't really like the Novo Nordisk. He didn't like that insulin. It didn't work as well. So the biggest thing is, now, so when you're going through all this, are you having to do prior authorizations to get what you want, or do they just constantly keep yanking your chain and changing your insulin and they don't give you any options?
They keep yanking my chain for the insulin. Yeah. I've changed within the last 3 years. I've changed twice. And it made no sense.
Well, it doesn't. I'll tell you why it doesn't make any sense, because it's not that different in price. I just showed you how it's not that different in price there.
Yeah.
And if you go to drugchannels.net, you'll see that the uptick in the list price of all those drugs is just them jockeying for position on a formulary.
Yeah. And I can't even get the test strips that I want to use.
And insulin is a particular thing that honestly, I really just believe, I think there needs to be something, and I don't even know how we would go about doing this exactly, but for things like insulin, EpiPens,
Yeah.
there is no middleman.
And there's no cure.
There shouldn't be a middleman. Yes, okay, so you have to go to the pharmacy counter and it's still controlled or whatever, but it doesn't need to be what it is. Pharmacies should just be able to stock the 3 brands of insulin, and people should be able to get the insulin that they want. That's just period.
Yes.
That's just it. I don't understand the insulin thing. And I think it's a big, and even most recently, I mean, Trump tried to do what he could do with an executive order that was for, clinics that weren't hospitals, weren't 340B hospitals, but they were 340B clinics, I think. Now, Biden just put a, halt on that particular rule.
Yes.
Where the savings would be passed through. He just put a halt on that rule just to look at it. We're hoping, advocates are pushing. It didn't help that many people, but about 29% of people that do show up to those clinics are in fact uninsured. So it did cause it to be a lot cheaper for those folks.
Mm-hmm.
But man, the advocacy in the diabetes space, I mean, you just want to scream at everybody. And I know advocates who scream at the pharmaceutical companies, they scream at the PBMs. You guys are yanked over the chains more than just about any other group with the drug stuff, really, with the pricing stuff. It's some of the most egregious. My recommendation is, I mean, do you even try to appeal or anything like that when you're do you try to do?
You know what, I've tried, and I think because I got burned so many times for trying to appeal, I got complacent where, why bother? It doesn't work. But this past
One
year,
of the things you can
it's been
also
really bad.
One of the things that you can also do is really put in a complaint and speak with your human resources department and those folks that pick your plans and that pick these people to do this to you.
Okay.
I mean, I would highly recommend that, because, they want to keep good employees and they want their employees to be happy. And we've had that be effective before.
Okay.
Encouraging, and feel free to email me and I can send you some tips on that. And I can even connect you with somebody who can help you, who can really help you with that if you want.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Good. Charles, I see your hand up there.
Yes, number of questions. Jeff, if you can think of this to ask Terry, I'll ask first. But think about the WOW Cash Appointments app and Dr. Arshad's partnership with Drexy, that wholesale PBM that charges monthly to offer wholesale prices, number one. then also that overseas drug buyer that delivers to our patient's door that can help folks save a boatload of money. And then for you, Terry, and Dr. Campbell, and maybe Kishore, we had intellectual property lawyer Stefan Kinsella on a year ago, who really nailed pharma and FDA for IP abuse. It's a very controversial area, so controversial that no one really talks about it because it's like a non-starter. But he's convinced that being able to prohibit competition until generics arrive is a real big cause of the bottleneck and the high prices. I don't know if you guys want to touch that. It's almost like something that will never happen. But he considers it a big deal. So Jeff, you want to start, and then you guys can think about the IP question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, no, that has been an area that, we got involved in, was being able to get people to have the ability to do that personal importation. So that's been a real big benefit for people. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover all the meds that are out there, but it helps in many instances. And then within that app, they worked on a per person, per employee type mentality inside that WOW app. So if you use the built-in drug program that they offer, you're going to get the meds at typically about 20 some odd % lower than GoodRx on its very best day. So they basically gone, there's still some of that PBM built into the thing, but it's much more, closer to the bone. So there's a few things that are happening, but again, they're only hitting a small percentage of the population. So that kind of covers that aspect of it. But yeah, I'd like to hear what everybody has to say on the balance of what Charles was asking about.
We don't necessarily, mainly because I don't know enough about it, but I do know it's a problem. I do know that the optics of it are bad. The patent stuff is, you've got drugs like, they were supposed to be off patent here sometime pretty soon, and now they've been extended to 2029 or 2033. I mean, it does, it does make you wonder. And it does make what can we do about it? I know there is some movement in Congress to start to address this. It's just, I'm not dodging the question because pharma funds us at all. That's not why I'm doing it. It's just I'm not versed enough in it, because oftentimes I'll get told, well, we're only raising it for this particular condition, or we did it for, we did this subset clinical trial. It is very complicated. And I can't answer it in a really like the way I can answer other things. Like, I think rebates should be gone. Like, we should pass rebates through. I don't exactly fully comprehend all of that. I would love somebody else who maybe does have a little more patent experience to speak to it. But I do know it's an issue, and I do know that people, raise their eyebrows about it and are concerned because drugs that should be off patent seem to be not getting off forever.
It's very much the case. It's
very much so. It's very much the case. It's not necessarily my wheelhouse, so I'm not gonna. But I would love to hear anybody else's thoughts. I mean, I know patients are angry about it. I know it upsets people, and I know I read all sorts of articles about it. And like I said, I do watch, the advocacy movement towards what may or may not be done about that. I've heard senators and representatives talk about it as well. So,
talking about it certainly brings attention to it. So that's at least part of the battle right there. Well, I want to tell you, Terry, as it turns out, we've reached the end of our day here. And I do appreciate you being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the questions. And like I said, I put my email in the notes to everyone. If anybody has any questions after the call or want to get in touch with me about anything, please do. I'd love to hear from you, and hope you all have a nice night.